Welcome to my podcast, and I'm delighted to say that I'm sitting with a wonderful Dutch historian intellectual, Rutger Bregman, who I actually contacted through the guise of Instagram, and he replied. So thank you, Rutger, and thank you so much for joining me here today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really an extraordinary pleasure to be here.
It all began for me when I was gathering people together for a weekend to remember. And actually, I'd been introduced to your books by my number 5 sister, whose husband is actually Dutch. Mm-hmm. But separately, anyway, she had very much enjoyed your book, which I thought I would as well. So I picked up Humankind, and I'm really interested in the concept of kindness and something which is positive to look forward to. What I was doing in September last year was about gathering people to remember the bonds of friendship and what we share, rather than what we fight about. And thus I reached out to you at far too short notice, but I'm very glad we've struck up a friendship. I hope. And you'll come back again another time.
I would love to, yeah. Anytime.
So, Rutger, I know you're from Holland and actually the Netherlands, which I think I always prefer. And I've just been on a cruise which started in the Netherlands. And funny enough, even just walking through the polders and the dikes and understanding the engineering and how, as a culture, as a nation, you've created your land has given me such a great insight into what I've read, in a sense, and the ethos behind, I suppose, living in the Netherlands, where it is very much a sense of communality, if you like, if I can put it like that.
Yeah. My wife and I just lived for a year in New York, and it's kind of funny how you understand your own country better after being abroad for a while. Then you suddenly start to see like, oh yeah, we are weird. We are peculiar. We're strange. We're different from others. I think we're mostly known for our directness, right? Our honesty. Some would say our rudeness. And that's something I have to get used to again and again when I talk to foreigners. Like in America, that's happened all the time, where I would get the feeling that I understood someone. Like, for example, if someone says, hey, we should really have lunch sometime. Like in my dictionary, that means we really should have lunch sometime. So I'm already about to grab my agenda. But in other cultures, the words do not always necessarily mean what they mean in the dictionary. But indeed, also that directness of saying what you think, speaking out loud. Maybe it goes back to a culture of equality. Some historians say that because the Dutch have always had to fight against the water, God created the earth, we like to say, but we, the Dutch, created the Netherlands. Yes. And, you know, when the dikes break, then everyone's equal. Then it's just we have to work together or else we're all going to drown. I'm not saying we have the definitive theory here, but I'm very proud to be Dutch. Let's put it like that.
I'm not surprised. And I felt, curiously enough, that walking through the polders and understanding how they worked and what had happened and why they were there made me understand the fact that I think every Dutchman has to be an engineer and has to problem solve and has to understand the intricacies of relationship with the land in order to make it work. And my brother-in-law, who's Dutch, is an engineer, so I completely understand. Well, he is an engineer, because he has to be.
Yeah.
But it was absolutely fascinating, and you have to trade as well. And I loved the practicality of the windmills. I think they were phenomenal. So the tiny part that I saw, other than the fact that I think you have to survive Amsterdam in terms of the bicycles.
Yeah.
I found the cyclists were coming out of left, right, and I almost thought they were coming down and up and down. It was quite confusing.
Yeah.
But
it was shortly after I finished Humankind, I spent some time learning more about my own country's history, because this was a time when more and more people started to get worried about global warming. And I thought every nation needs its own story, because to only have one global story that appeals to humanity, maybe we need like different versions for each country so that they find a way to do something about this huge global challenge. And for the Dutch, it obviously would have to be a story about water. And I really dug into this history of something terrible that happened in the 1950s, a huge flooding in 1953 that actually also hit England at the time. Lots of people drowned. And after that, there was a huge wake-up call, and we built the so-called Delta Works, which are still seen as one of the 7 modern wonders of engineering. I think like Scientific American or something at some point had a competition like what are the 7 wonders of modern engineering? And the Delta works that were built in the Netherlands are one of them. And these huge structures that protect the whole country against the sea. And it's basically a country that in many ways should not be able to exist, but somehow we've made it work.
And you've also created extraordinary works of art, from Rembrandt's paintings to the different museums, the Rijksmuseum and everything else that I visited. Within Amsterdam, for example, and I like the idea you were in New York, which was obviously firstly New Amsterdam, but quite a watery settlement to begin with across the water. But it was extraordinary, so I did much enjoyed it. I then carried on, but it was a very good place to begin. Here at Highclere, I'm landlocked, and I read Humankind with interest because the earliest civilizations were certainly Neolithic or Bronze Age. You can see the remains of the Bronze Age tumuli and the Iron Age forts, and the transition from early hunting settlements or inhabitants towards the farming settlements of the later years. I suppose I would definitely dispute that the first hunters were any kinder, perhaps, than the farming agrarian settlements later on. But you can see it in the landscape here, so it always gives me pause for thought. And with the Iron Age fort on the top of a hill, you only build a fort because you're protecting yourself from those around you. We've clearly been fighting for much of humankind's existence. But your book was obviously provocative, and I have spent quite a lot of my time reading. It's my favourite topic is Bronze Age and Neolithic settlements. And I've also studied ancient languages because I find how the fields and what we do translates into linguistics entirely fascinating. But have you spent quite a lot of time yourself looking back at the earliest times, or where did your earliest interest in history begin?
So as a historian, I've never really been able to specialize, to be honest. I am just interested in everything. I think you and I are both voracious readers. And when I was around 22, 23, I initially had the plan to go on and do a PhD and, to have the traditional academic career path, try and become a professor. And then maybe when I was 50 or 60, I would finally be able to write the books that I wanted to write about the great questions of human history. Like, why are we here? Where did we come from? Why did the Europeans conquer the globe? What makes Homo sapiens specials? Why is Highclere not inhabited by bonobos, right? And turns out that I didn't want to wait until I was 50 or 60. So when I was 23, I just immediately jumped into it and started writing books for a general audience. And that kind of escalated. So Humankind has been my biggest book so far, which is really a book about anthropology, about history, about philosophy. It is a book about the great question of who we are as a species. There's this really old theory in Western culture, specifically, that comes back again and again in our plays, in our films, in all the stories we tell ourselves, which says that human civilization is just a thin veneer. It's just a thin layer. But that below that, the etiquette and the fancy dresses and whatever we do to pretend, below that lies raw human nature. And below that, we are still primates. We are driven by the forces of competition, of aggression, and you name it. We are fundamentally selfish. It's a story that comes back again and again. In the UK, probably most famously, the story of Lord of the Flies, right? That has recently been recreated by the BBC.
I didn't like watching that, I'm afraid. It's not my most favourite story, and I don't necessarily accept it either.
It's a pretty depressing story, but hugely influential, but also an old story. I would say it's a variation of that veneer theory that comes back again and again. Now, what Humankind is, what I'm trying to do in that book, is to basically debunk that. And that takes me about 500 pages because because it's such a, how do you say that? It's such a pernicious theory that comes back again and again. And we've really been brainwashed to believe it. Still, so many Netflix series, for example, whether it's about zombies or whether it's Game of Thrones or whether it's Succession, again and again, it comes back to this idea like, you know what? People deep down are just selfish. And I think that's just fundamentally not true. I think humans are the product of something that evolutionary anthropologists call survival of the friendliest. And that is the secret of our success. It is the fact that we have been able to cooperate on a skill that no other animal in the whole animal kingdom has been able to do. That is what explains why we have been so successful. So yeah, it's a big story that I wanted to get out there.
Well, I completely understood your theory of the cooperation. And I think cooperation for me is at the heart of what we do here. And every so often I try and use a year or an event from the past to bring it forward, to try to remember and make it visible today. It is about cooperation. So I think we had 30 different ambassadors. We hung all the flags around the castle to bring people together, to remember what it is to be a friend, to be kind, and say, hello, how are you? From all around the world. So I suppose I share some of your hope, but I find some of it slightly more challenging in that I think there's more than a thin veneer of kindness, but I think that theory has been misused and abused in different ways to control people.
Yes.
Whether you blame it on religion or you blame it on early leaders.
Yeah.
It's a way of trying to put in a structure which allows a pyramidal control, which is why I really enjoyed walking across the polders in Holland, because you can't have a pyramidal control there.
Yeah.
It has to be a situation of cooperation.
Yeah.
And curiously enough, in this world at Highclere, I think as I've got ever older, I'm always interested in teamwork, cooperation, working together. And I would hope there's no unkindness here. There is support and friendliness. And around it, I've created Friends of Highclere. So I don't use words lightly. It's about being together and then doing things together and taking away from that we can look back at things we've done together rather than acquiring things and judging ourselves by the things we've acquired as opposed to other people who've acquired better, blingier things or not, when you either feel down or you feel up. So I'm very anti that whilst I post on Instagram. I'm trying to tell stories on Instagram.
Exactly, and it's fun to get the story out, right? Yeah.
But it is, I find, entirely fascinating. And whilst this is a world which looks back to the structure of a lord and a lady, actually I think today it's more Dutch, it's more flat.
Yeah.
And we are all in it today, conserving and stewarding what we look after from 6,500 BC, hoping there's something for the future.
Yeah.
And it's one which is achieved with your kindness. Those theories which go forward. But not everybody is in it. And one of my favourite plays is The Tempest by Shakespeare. Do you know that play at all?
I'm not super familiar with it. That was been lacking in my Dutch education. So
well, it's his birthday, Shakespeare's birthday today. I think this will go out a little bit later, but the 23rd of April. And The Tempest is an extraordinary play where everyone is shipwrecked. So they go off into a world and have to learn to be together. Caliban's a bad person, and he becomes, whether he can become reformed. Ariel's a better person, will he stay like that? There's good and bad people. At the end, they're returned to the world by Shakespeare. It's a brilliant play. And at the end, they're all in a circle holding hands. And most of them are holding hands. But there's one, Antonia, the usurper, who cast his brother out and got rid of him to this island, stands outside. So he is the amoral person. He's not immoral or moral. He's amoral. And I'm never quite sure how you would deal in your terms with those amoral people. How do you deal with them?
Let me tell you another story of a shipwreck. Maybe that helps a little bit here. So I've always believed that we humans, we become the stories that we tell ourselves. We're not just, how do you say that? We've not just evolved to be either this way as like fundamentally kind or social or fundamentally aggressive or etc. We're also very cultural creatures, and that's all about the power of storytelling. So we talked about The Tempest, about Lord of the Flies, maybe Lord of the Flies in particular, pretty depressing story that I think tends to bring out kind of the nastiness in people.
Yes.
A lot of people, when I wrote about that, reached out to me and said, hey, that's what boarding school has been for me. It's like basically a pretty traumatic experience. And the people also came up to me and said, like, but isn't like bullying, for example, in school, isn't that just a natural part of kids' behavior? Isn't that always going to happen? I was like, no, not at all. We've got so much evidence from sociology, from psychology, that bullying is actually a quite weird thing, an unnatural thing to happen among kids. It only happens in specific environments called so-called total institutions, where basically the kids can't get out. It's a little bit like a prison or a nursing home. That's also where a lot of bullying happens. And the ages are not mixed, but people are all of one age group. This is a very highly unnatural environment, and then bullying starts to happen. But anyway, a completely different story that I tell in the book, Humankind, about a shipwreck, which has always fascinated me because you kind of get the feeling like, what would happen, right? If you shipwreck on an uninhabited island, then the real you comes out, right? How will you behave in such a situation? A little bit like when a country gets flooded. What will you do? And for this book, I wondered, has it ever happened in real life? Has there ever been a real case of a real Lord of the Flies when real kids shipwrecked on a real island? And that journey started for me, when was it? I think 2015, 2016. I was just in Utrecht, lying in bed with my laptop, and I started to Google real Lord of the Flies, kids shipwrecked on an island, blah, blah, blah. I spent about an hour Googling. And at some point, I came upon an obscure blog where a weird story was being told that this had supposedly had happened in 1977 near Tonga, which is an island group in the Pacific Ocean, where supposedly these 6 kids had shipwrecked and had survived for more than a year. And I was just so fascinated. I was like, I want to find out more about this, because I thought if this happened in 1977, then they might very well still be alive and maybe I could interview them. But I kept looking, I kept Googling, I kept doing research. I kept going down in the archives of old newspapers in Australia, in the UK, in the US. Couldn't find anything. And I was like, this is probably not true. But then one day I tried again and I made a little typo. So instead of looking at newspapers in 1977, I looked at newspapers in 1966 and the years around it, 1965, 1967. And boom, suddenly I saw it. That indeed it had happened on the island of Ata near Tonga, where indeed 6 kids had survived for 15 months. And it was this extraordinary tale of friendship, actually. They had survived by staying friends, and they were doing actually quite well when they were found by this Australian captain named Peter Warner. So then I was like, but they may still be alive. And it was really the most fun story to research in my whole career. It's really been the highlight of my career so far, because again, I just started Googling and I discovered that the captain who found them was a guy named Peter Warner, now already in his 90s, early 90s. And he was actually the son of Arthur Warner, who was an incredibly wealthy man in Australia, a big friend of the Murdochs and one of the magnates of the radio empires. They sold all the radios in Australia. But Peter, he just didn't want to live a life of business. He said to his father when he was young, I don't want to fight people, I want to fight nature. So he ran off from home and he said, I'm going to live my life as a sailor. And after a while, I was able to track down Peter and I said, hey, can I come over to Australia and interview you? And maybe you can also introduce me to some of the survivors. Perhaps they're still alive. And that's basically what happened. So I traveled to Brisbane, drove down south 3 hours. And then in this little village by the side of the road, there was this old captain telling me this extraordinary story of what had happened more than half a century earlier, of how these 6 boys, now older men, and later I also interviewed some of them, survived for 15 months. And honestly, if it would be a Hollywood movie or a series for ITV or whatever, people would say, this story is so unrealistic. You know, it is too naive. That's not how real kids would behave. But it really did happen. They survived by being the best of friends and being loyal to one another.
It is amazing, and it does completely give one hope. I think sometimes when you find people who are bullies, not in any specific year class, it's because they are unhappy with their own family personal situation and they therefore take it out on others. So I think there are different reasons for being unhappy and often personal family reasons for being happier. And it's how you deal with those experiences and that you do deal with them. I think sometimes people can get blocked in and they repeat their behaviour time and time again. It's like they're in a box and they're hitting against the walls of it because there's something which in their own lives makes them personally, emotionally unhappy.
Yeah.
And they don't sometimes even want to be helped. I think there's as many different people as there are
Of course.
in the world.
Yeah.
And I sometimes think that the structure of family and friends cannot be underestimated. And the sharing of food and the breaking of bread and the sharing of wine is, to my mind, also incredibly important. I just don't know where we've all gone wrong sometimes.
And the attachment from an early age, right? I mean, my wife and I did the tour this morning at Highclere, where we were told that, the kids, were put, at the fourth floor, and then they come down for an hour a day or something. And I'm sure that's not the way things are being done anymore. Because like a modern psychologist would say, oh my God, like you'll get severe attachment problems because of that. Like kids really need their parents, right? They really need that love, that security, that feeling that they're being valued. And I think I found that always a fascinating aspect about humans. Like we come into this world and we are so utterly incompetent.
Yes.
Like I recently became a father. We've got a 4-year-old and a 1-year-old. And like the 4-year-old can still barely eat on her own, right? It's like it takes so long for humans to be able to actually do something. Yes. But that is the power. That is why we're able to cooperate so well. Because we know. People say like, I built this company, I did this, You didn't do that. It's always we did this.
It is always we, and I hear politicians on the morning on Radio 4, BBC in the morning, and they start saying, well, I thought we should do this, and I did this, and I said we do that. And I just have to turn it off. I can't bear it. But to the point, in the fourth Earl of Carnarvon in Victorian times, for example, he and his wife were very close to the children.
Interesting.
They had 4 children. And after his wife died in childbirth, and their youngest daughter, Victoria, was 2 weeks old. And their father more or less gave up his job in politics in order to look after his family. And you could see him in his diaries trying to find ways of bringing his children through their bereavement. He missed his wife so much. And he sort of gave his son a camera and wanted him to get good at photography. And he sort of took them sailing. And he tried many different ways to help them get over their grief. So I think he was unusual. So my prejudices there were hugely misinformed when I read the diary. The fifth Earl, the Tutankhamun, had 2 children. I think he was closer to his daughter than his son. But it was also a time of the First World War, so there's different reasons. And he himself was a bit invalided and not very well quite often. Hence he went to Egypt much of the time.
Yeah.
So there's different reasons there. Rather than generalise, I'm sort of more careful. Funnily enough, the fourth Earl, who spent more time with his children than you might appreciate from the general direction of idea about Victorian parenting, was involved in politics and in the Reform Bill of 1867, which was quite a big deal in this country. But he was also interested because he felt that at that time, apart from enfranchising other people for different reasons with which he was debating, he felt one large section of this country did not have the vote, and that was women. So it was very interesting. He was ahead of his time, as other people were in England. It's a democracy which is quite elastic because it's not written down, as there were different movements to take it forward. So I've always liked the fourth Earl. He's a kind man, a good man, definitely. But so I suppose I studied 19th century history, but now I'm much further back in my interest, back to my Neolithic times.
Yeah.
But the 19th century and the 2 world wars and how unkind we were in those to each other, I found fascinating.
Yeah.
And I wished to research and read and contemplate them because they've defined the world in which we're living, whether it's the Middle East now or our current prejudices and assumptions of what we're doing here. Which is quite interesting.
Yeah, ever since I was a young boy, I was always fascinated with the Second World War. Obviously, from 1940 to 1945, the Netherlands was occupied by the Nazis. And again, the question that I kept coming back to is, what would I have done, right? What do moments of crises, what do they bring out in you? And after the war, lots of Dutch people pretended that they had joined the resistance, right? Historians call this the resistance myth, this notion that a small, brave country stood up against the terrible, evil Nazis. Well, it's not true. It's really not true. Most people didn't like the Nazis, but they didn't resist them either. They sometimes even collaborated with them. The Dutch police helped rounding up Jewish people to send them up to the gas chambers. The Dutch public transport, the trains, the whole train system famously collaborated. Now, does that mean that we are fundamentally bad, selfish, cowards, whatever? I struggle a lot with that in the book, of course, and I try to come at a nuanced answer. But for my latest book, which is called Moral Ambition, I had the pleasure of researching that question that fascinated me ever since I was a boy. Like, would I have done the right thing? What makes resistance heroes different from other people? And it turns out that after the war, there were some huge research projects in which researchers interviewed hundreds and hundreds of people who had actually done the right thing during the war. And they tried to figure out what makes these people different. Are they rich or poor, young, old, men, women, introverts, extroverts? Is there a variable that explains why they did what they did? And what's funny is that they couldn't find anything. It was really a cross-section of the population. What they did find after a lot of work, that there was one thing that explained incredibly well whether people would do the right thing, yes or no. And that was the mere matter of being asked. If you were asked, can you help? Can you give a hiding place to these people who are really in need? Or can you do a small thing, distribute some underground newspapers? Then in 96% of all cases, people said yes. And this also explains why the resistance wasn't evenly spread out over the country. No, it was a local phenomenon. It was a little bit like a virus. You remember that from a couple of years ago with COVID. You had these pockets and then boom, it starts spreading. And it's such a simple, but for me, incredibly profound insight that, we spent lots of time obsessing over, who am I? What are my traits? Am I an introvert? Am I an extrovert? What would I have done? Well, that's basically asking the wrong question. Too often we're thinking about human psychology, while instead we should look at human sociology. It is like, how do we behave as a group? And also, how can we inspire each other to do the right thing? And especially if you are already doing the right thing, then don't forget to ask others to join in.
No, I found that part of your book very interesting, actually. And it often starts with the most unlikely people, which is what you'd discovered in that particular instance. And I'm sure it happened again. It's often the unconventional people who aren't afraid to ask.
Especially initially, yeah. So it's interesting that if you look at the most successful entrepreneurs, if you go to a place like Silicon Valley, you'll see that a lot of the most successful entrepreneurs are somewhere on the spectrum. It's also interesting that it's true for quite a lot of the most effective activists. So think of people like a Ralph Nader in the 70s, who was hugely influential. Or, today someone like Greta Thunberg, who is openly talked about having Asperger's syndrome. I think there's something about those people that enables them to just ignore social convention and just to do their own thinking and realize that, hey, if A is true, if B is true, then shouldn't we do C? Why does everyone keep ignoring the elephant in the room? And that's often how it starts. You often need those people. So indeed, in the book, I talk about a man named Arnold Dowis, who was one of the most influential organizers of the resistance in the east of the Netherlands. And he settled down in this little village called Nieuw-Lande. And that village became really famous because it was one of only two villages who were recognized after the war by Yad Vashem, the institution in Israel that honors the so-called righteous among the nations, those people who did the right thing and helped the persecuted Jews. And they honored that whole village. That happened only twice. And Nieuw-Lande in the Netherlands was one of those places where an extraordinary amount of people did the right thing. At some point, almost 100 people were hiding in this very tiny village. And many of them had been asked by Arnold Dowis. I describe him as a super spreader of the resistance virus. And I say asked, but he was pretty blunt about it. He almost bullied some people into doing the right thing. There's this one hilarious anecdote in his memoirs, the memoirs of his friend whom he worked with, Max Leons. And it's about the time they arrived at a farmer's house, and they actually had a Jewish couple with them. But the farmer hadn't agreed to anything. So they said, okay, you wait outside first. we'll go in first and we'll talk to him, we'll talk to his wife, and, we'll try to get you a hiding place. But they didn't want it. They were like, no. We're scared. We really, no, sorry, there's no place to hide here. And they talked and were unable to convince the couple to take in any persecuted Jews. And then at some point they said, you know what? They're actually outside. We'll bring them in. Welcome. Have a good time. Well, we're off. Yeah. And in the end, the Jewish couple survived the war. Because, when you actually start building a relationship, even if you're kind of forced to do it. But it's this incredible story of how just a few people were able to spread that virus in an entire region. And so many people survived because of it.
It was very inspiring, and he was such an unlikely man. I think sometimes you are unconventional because you are slightly on the spectrum. Mm-hmm. I think sometimes you are unconventional because of experience, and you become less afraid to do things because of what's happened. Yep. And for my part, I had quite a privileged upbringing and all perfectly comfortable and predictable. Mm-hmm. But then because both my father died, I'm one of 6 girls, and then our mother died quite young of cancer, suddenly you're in a very different world. And whilst to start with that centre of your world falls apart, you then have to understand and work out how to survive. And the most important thing to all of I and my sisters then was someone else's kindness. That's all I remember. That's what mattered. And then from that, the courage to do other things has spread, because I know every day I don't get another day. This is today. So I'm going to do my best today. Yeah. And I will WhatsApp people or welcome people or just try. And if they say no, they say no. But it's amazing how many amazing people such as yourself reply. And I find that fascinating. And equally well, people contact me and I just end up in the most extraordinary places. And I normally say yes. Yes. Yeah. And I find that extraordinary and end up going to different parts of the world or doing different things or being in different environments. And I think out of that comes something good and usually kind, because you've replied out of kindness. So I find that entirely fascinating. And I think I and my sisters have blossomed is the wrong word. I'm not sure we've blossomed at all, but have nevertheless taken steps to do things which we think are right, because that's what matters. Yeah. So
it's again that contagiousness, right? The contagiousness of our behavior, and in this case of our kindness. There's this simple study that I've always loved, done by 2 social psychologists, one of them Nicholas Christakis, who has actually done an extraordinary study of shipwrecks. That's why I'm reminded of him. He compares a lot of shipwrecks in his book and then tries to find lessons about human nature.
Whereas where I spend time in Cornwall, they wreck the ships in order to plunder them.
Well, there's some really cynical stories indeed, and depressing stories of how people behave during those times as well. But anyway, he wrote a book about contagion, basically, of how people influence one another. And one of the studies in that book is about when people play a kind of, one of those economic games. So they're being brought into a lab. They have to play a game, in this case, I think with 2 others. And I think what happens is that at some point, someone that they're playing the game with is being unusually kind. They don't know that in reality, the 2 others are actually accomplices of the researchers. Okay. But they're unusually kind. And then what happens is that they can see that in the second round, when that person who was being influenced by that also becomes more kind and starts being more generous to others. And then in the third round and the fourth round, you can see that kindness virus spreading, so that at some point you see people being more kind, even though they're playing with players who weren't there in the first round. So you can really see it ripple through the whole ecosystem. And I think that's such a simple but powerful metaphor for our own lives. Whenever we perform a small act of kindness, we throw a pebble in the pond, and we never know where it all ends up, right? And how it influences us in the end. But I'm a big believer that if you keep throwing those pebbles in the pond, that you surround yourself with, just waves and waves of kindness. And so much will come back to you as well. I think this is what a lot of people realize, especially later in their life, that maybe when you're in primary school or high school, maybe being nasty and a little bit of a bully was in some situations was high status. And those people got more respect, especially if it was a toxic environment. But as we get older, I think it starts to shift. And the people who are more selfish, they will find themselves to be alone increasingly. And they will get more depressed. They die earlier. It is kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. To put it in evolutionary terms, or the terms of a biologist, it's not adaptive. It doesn't get you anywhere.
It doesn't adaptive, and I think inclusion is really important. I mean, we keep horses and dogs. And with my horses, I find it fascinating working with them in a field about, how they're manoeuvring and how to go into the field so you're not knocked over. And how over time, sometimes the relationship between them change. When we sadly lose one of the horses, we always leave it in the field with its friends. And they stand by it when it's ill. And they stand by it. And when it's died. And then after a while, they know it's no longer there and they walk away. But the rest of them stay together. And they do stay together and they do look after each other. I'm often using some of working with the horses who are much bigger than me. So you have to work with them because they won't otherwise. You can't force them to do what you want them to do. So it's figuring out how to work with them and how their society works as well. And I can't impose my society on them. I have to get them to work with me. And I think some of the lessons you learn from the animals around you are jolly useful when you're trying to persuade people you work with to take a certain course and to be kinder in the office because then they're more included rather than not.
That's so interesting. It reminds me of a Dutch primatologist, Frans de Waal. He passed away a few years ago, sadly. He coined that term, the veneer theory that I mentioned earlier, that notion that civilization is only a thin veneer. He was also a strong advocate against that theory. But he became famous by writing books about primates and then also about other animals. One of the titles of one of his books is, Are We Smart Enough to Know How Smart Animals Are? And you could also ask yourself, are we compassionate enough to know how compassionate other animals are? Are we empathetic enough to know how empathetic other animals are? Every single week, new papers get published in Science and Nature showing that suddenly pigs turn out to be able to count, chickens have empathy for one another, cows engage in rituals, whatever. It is we have been so silly for such a long time.
We have, but I think we put words into cows' mouths, and into horses' mouths. So I observe their behaviour without putting words into it. But in terms of veneering, one of my favourite books is one by Charles Dickens. It's called Our Mutual Friend. And it starts in the very first chapter with a family called the Veneerings. And they've made their money from dirt and waste. And it's all about their shiny house, very new, brand new, and their tablecloths which match their napkins. And it's this veneer of civilization over where it came from. So there's that which I think then also fights its way up to put down other people in order to fight it up. So you have this shiniest possible veneer.
Being a Dutchman who's used to a world where the words mean what they mean in the dictionary. I recently gave a series of lectures for the BBC, and I would have this...
With the Reith lectures.
Yeah, the Reith lectures. Yeah, and I had some misunderstandings with the team as well, where it's just so funny that you have to try and find out what they're saying between the lines.
Completely. Well, in England, I think we're very good at being British and never quite expressing carefully what we don't actually mean, which is so funny.
Yeah.
And there's an unspoken language in sometimes what we express.
Yeah.
But having said that, can I express directly and just ask you, if you were to come to a summer ball here, and you could bring anyone apart from your beloved wife, from history or from today, who would you ask to come with you to a summer ball?
So I'm immediately reminded of the great British philosopher Bertrand Russell, who had an enormous impact on me. I was, I think, 18, 19 years old and very much trying to find out who I was and who I wanted to become when a professor said, everyone needs to have his own intellectual hero. And I had never thought of that possibility of having an intellectual hero. I knew the concept of heroes, Achilles or Superman or whatever, but an intellectual hero, someone who's really brave with his ideas. And I just basically started doing some research, and then I stumbled upon this extraordinary character, indeed, who had a very privileged upbringing in the late 19th century, in Britain, and then had this amazing life full of successes, setbacks. He had 4 marriages. He won the Nobel Prize in Literature. He died almost in a plane crash, but survived, as he would always say, because he was in the smoking compartment. All the people in the non-smoking compartment died, but because the door wouldn't open, they all drowned. But he survived because he was a smoker. And he was responsible for some of the biggest breakthroughs in philosophy and in logic in the early 20th century, famous for Russell's paradox. And he became a staunch advocate for nuclear disarmament. He was imprisoned during the First World War because he didn't want to fight in the trenches. He made some big mistakes in his life, but had tremendous courage, and not just physical courage, but also intellectual courage. And reading his autobiography that he wrote when he was in his mid-90s had just an enormous impact on me. I was like, well, that is a monument of a life. That is, if there's no immortality, and I wasn't sure at the time, if there's perhaps no life after death, then this is the thing that comes closest. This is how you build something that will echo through eternity and have a lot of fun at the same time. I would love to meet Bertrand Russell sometime and smoke a pipe. And
Bregman, I can give you a smoking area outside the tent.
Thank you.
Which is
much
perfect.
appreciated. Yeah. Who would you bring?
Who would I bring? Wow. I'm guilty of bardolatry, William Shakespeare. Mm-hmm. I think his legacy, his words, his sonnets are entirely extraordinary. I also quite like Boethius and his Consolation of Philosophy and the circularity of the world he portrayed rather than our linear progression today. I quite like Marcus Aurelius. So actually, I've got loads of different people I'd bring. So since it's my party, I'll bring them all.
Nice.
Anyway, thank you so much for joining me here today. It's been really lovely to meet you. And thank you so much for replying to me from a mad message on Instagram.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.